Guilford, Connecticut was founded in May 1639. Today, there are several organizations which have taken on the responsibility of preserving Guilford's earliest history. The next hour will provide a glimpse into 5 of Guilford's museums.
Welcome to the Henry Whitfield State Museum in Guilford, Connecticut. This is Connecticut's oldest house and New England's oldest stone house. It was built in 1639 and over the last 365 years has seen quite a number of changes. People have been visiting this house since 1904, shortly after it was named the State Museum. The collections here are extensive and they focus in on the 17th and 18th century with a few other pieces from the 19th century. The structure itself is also unique in that it's the only surviving example of this type of architecture here in the United States. It's a medieval design, not colonial, and it has, as I said, served a dual purpose over the years of being a private home and then a community structure. Many different things have happened here over the years with the community. It was a defensive building when it started out as Henry Whitfield's home, and then through the years was lived in by tenants, prosperous merchants, and then, as I said, since 1639, the building has evolved and become a state museum. The building has been restored twice. As people travel through the house, they're seeing a collection with the house as a backdrop. The structure has won awards and has been studied over the years for its restoration work. So our visitors come here and their interests range from the structure itself to the furniture and artifacts to the unique history of the building right up until the present. This is the Great Hall of the house, the main room of all the activity when the Whitfields lived here in the 1640s. This room would have been used for entertaining, cooking, and eating. In a smaller home that didn't have as many rooms as the Whitfield house, the hall would have also included the sleeping functions. The north end of the house has the oldest section, the oldest construction, including some original mortar with clamshell in it. The room today is filled with a variety of English and American pieces from the early 17th century to illustrate what people used. Probably the most important piece in the room today is the Governor William Leete chair. William Leete was one of the first governors of Connecticut Colony, and we are pleased to have his chair, one of the only artifacts related to a governor of Connecticut in the 17th century, here in our collection. This is the north chamber of the museum on the second floor, one of 3 rooms. The house originally only had 2 rooms on the second floor. This room was divided in half by a modern staircase to the attic. And in this room we can see the second floor fireplace that's connected to the north fireplace we've seen in the Great Hall. This room has primarily early 18th century pieces that illustrate what might have been in a bedroom type setting, which is probably what this area was used for when the Whitfields originally lived here. We're now in the south chamber, which originally was part of the north chamber, making one large room on the second floor. This room has collection pieces in it that illustrate the necessity of having furnishings that were multi-purpose and could be moved and expanded. There's a drop leaf table in here, a sliding leaf table, a folding bed. There are also some books and other artifacts related to the Griffing family who owned the house in the 1770s into the 1800s. Probably the most interesting part of this room is in the corner of the room is the only known location of an original window dating back to the house's construction in 1639. We call it the corner window, and the legend is that you were able to view Long Island Sound and the harbor from the window, which aided in the defense of the community. We're now in the garret, or the attic of the house, the 3rd level. Originally, when the Whitfields lived here in the 1640s, this space was relatively unused. You had to climb up a ladder to access the space, and there was no heat and no windows. Since the 1930s, the museum has used this area for a series of displays, personal items, the Revolutionary War, maritime artifacts, local interests, textiles, and we also have housed up here the 1726 Ebenezer Parmalee tower clock, which was the first tower clock made here in the colonies. Previous to that time, all clocks were imported from Europe. And when this clock was completed and installed in the second meeting house here in Guilford, that meeting house became the first meeting house in New England to have a steeple, a bell, and a clock.
Welcome to the Hyland House. George Hyland, the original owner of the house, was a sheep farmer. This 17th century house is an excellent example of a 2-over-2 house with an added lean-to. The house has been restored as far as possible to show the work of its earliest period. The hewn overhangs with corbel and chamfered beams on the exterior are a rarity in Connecticut. The preservation and restoration of the house was the work of the Dorothy Whitfield Historical Society, who purchased the property in 1916, saving the house from being torn down. Norman Isham, a nationally known preservation architect, was hired to do the work. The house was opened as a historic house museum in 1918 and has been open every summer since then. The house is open from June through Labor Day and weekends through mid-October or by appointment. The house is open Tuesdays through Saturdays, 10 to 4:30, and Sunday from noon to 4:30. Admission is free, but donations are gratefully accepted. Visitors to the Hyland House are able to see the 5 fireplaces and hand-hewn floors and walls. Displayed in the rooms of the house is a collection of 17th and 18th century furniture and decorative arts, including primitive utensils, slipware, rope bedsteads, family chests, and quilts. George Hyland's grandson, Ebenezer Parmley, is the most prominent resident of the house. As a shipwright and master of several metal and woodworking trades, he left his mark on the house, specifically adding a lean-to, thus changing the 2-over-2 house to a typical New England salt box. Ebenezer Parmley was known as the father of Connecticut clockmaking, and is best known for his 1727 tower clock, which kept time for an incredible 165 years in the steeple of the Congregational Church in Guilford. Visitors to the Hyland House are able to see many original and restored parts of the house. In the west parlor is a glass inset in the wall in which visitors can see the original lathes and plaster made from ground oyster shells mixed with hay. Later, horsehair was incorporated for strength. Obviously, that is not part of this, but the original lathes of the 17th century house are directly in front of you as you look. The kitchen or keeping room was added by Ebenezer Parmley, and visitors can see several different things as they come down from the 17th century house into the 18th century addition. The most important, obviously, is the fireplace. As you can see, the fireplace is much larger than the one in the west parlor, and not only that, but has a beehive oven with a metal door, which makes it much more possible to cook things regularly and less of a hit or miss opportunity. The 3 trammels also are able to be used, which were probably used both for cooking and drying food for winter. This fireplace is possible because, as you will be able to see in the upstairs chimney, Ebenezer broke into the original chimney, added a section, and now has 5 working fireplaces off a central chimney. The east parlor and east bedroom contain examples of 18th century paneling and molding done by Ebenezer Parmley. The east parlor is restored paneling, while the east bedroom has original. This parlor would have been the most formal room of the house, and as you can see, it has been set up as if they were entertaining their friends at tea. The front hall and stairway have the original banister and railings made by Ebenezer Parmley. They continue to the attic instead of stopping at the second floor, as was customary. The design of these banisters and railings is an acorn, perhaps because of the same tradition of the South pineapple, a symbol of hospitality. The west chamber is of interest to visitors specifically because at the time of restoration, a false wall was removed, behind which were found original paneling, the colors, fireplace, and the andirons still in it. The original floorboards and sideboards were made of whitewood, specifically the tulip tree. Walls in the 17th century were often boarded to save plaster, as lime was difficult to import, and oyster shells had to be substituted. The floorboards of this room date to 1691. Here in the loft, visitors can see the original 17th century clapboards that were the outside of the George Hyland house. When Ebenezer Parmley added his lean-to in the 18th century, he left the outside of the house untouched. And so today we can see what the house looked like when George Hyland lived here. Visitors are here given the opportunity to see the original 17th century chimney that was at the back of the George Hyland house, as well as the added 18th century section put on by Ebenezer Parmley, which provided him the opportunity to build the large fireplace downstairs under the loft in the kitchen or keeping room. This made it possible to have 5 working fireplaces from the now central chimney. One of the most outstanding features of visiting the Hyland House is the opportunity to see an original window. This one dates to 1691, the glass having come from England, the glass being a 1/16 of an inch thick. The east bedroom, like the east parlor downstairs, are examples of 18th century paneling and molding done by Ebenezer Parmley. This, however, is original paneling and is referred to as Beaulection paneling. This room has more original features than any other room in the house. It's the only room in the house that still has the plaster remaining on its walls. The floorboards and the doors are original to the house. And an additional added feature is the closet, added on by Ebenezer Parmley when he remodeled his house in the 18th century. Closets are very unusual in 18th century houses, and we're not awfully sure as to why Ebenezer put a closet in his bedroom. A visit to the Hyland House is an opportunity to return to the 17th and 18th century. Visitors can see how our ancestors lived and worked in a simpler but a more challenging time.
Welcome to the Thomas Griswold House Museum. This is one of 2 museums belonging to the Guilford Keeping Society. The house was historically owned by the Griswold family. They bought this land in 1695, and built this house about 1774. We got the date from the great-granddaughter of Thomas Griswold III, the builder. It was then home to his two sons, Ezra and John. It then became the home of Ezra and his son, George. When Ezra died, George Griswold lived in it as a single-family house with his family. We show the house as it looked during the period of George Griswold and his family, because that is the first time it was a single-family house. So we have made the paint colors, the furnishings, and the decorative objects be from that period, representative of things that were in George Griswold's inventory. We are open as a museum from June until October, and are open for special programs during the rest of the year. We also do numerous school programs here, particularly for the Guilford schools. What you're seeing here is the best room in a house typical of mid to late 18th century, prosperous middle-class family in Guilford. There are a number of homes like this in Guilford, and one of our objectives of the Guilford Keeping Society is to show how these homes might have looked early in their lives. The summer beam going across the room is still in evidence in this construction. In this case, nicely cased with wood, and as are all of the beams in this house. We have a typical Guilford 3-panel door. You'll find these in almost all Guilford houses from about 1740 to almost 1800. We have a chair rail going around the edge of the room, and then we have a fine Guilford cupboard in the corner. And then our fireplace is one of the few things that have been modified in this house. It was filled in sometime in the 19th century, and we now have an early 19th century stove in it, much as George Griswold would have had in the early part of the 19th century. This was George Griswold's parlor. We know that from his inventory, and this is where he had his best things, including an expensive carpet. Ours is a reproduction Brussels carpet made from a pattern designed about 1800 and imported from England. Carpets like this were the high end of what a person in George Griswold's status could have had, and they were readily purchased in New York, Boston, or New Haven. There are two pieces of furniture in this room that belong to the Griswold family, the low chest and the gilt mirror. The chest, we believe, came with George's wife, Nancy Landon, when they got married, and the mirror was purchased in 1830 by Mr. Griswold, and we do have the receipt for the mirror. The stenciling on the wall was done in 1980, when this house was made ready for a show house, but is based on an early Guilford house. And when you see the Medad stone house, our other property, you will see similar stenciling. The dark blue paint is a color called Prussian blue, which was one of the most expensive colors you could get at that time. And our paint study shows that this color was on the wall for probably almost 50 years. Very few coats of paint in this room. The brown baseboards are typical of the period where baseboards were painted a dark color to avoid showing the dirt. The small table next to the fireplace shows some of the things that we collect and show about the Griswold family and how they might have lived. We have books belonging to the family and other small objects. This room was used as a sitting room or family parlor, and we do know from George Griswold's inventory that that was the purpose that his family used it for. It looks very much like the parlor, but we have it furnished somewhat more simply. The color in this room is a greenish blue, which is a cheaper color than the Prussian blue in the parlor. The table is set for tea. People would have eaten in here. They would also spend evenings in here reading by the fire. And it was a room generally used every day, and one of the rooms where you would keep a fire going in the winter. The tablecloth on the table was woven by Abraham Dudley of Guilford, and the two chairs by the table were made for the Bartlett family and were purchased by the Guilford Keeping Society about 8 years ago. The corner cupboard in this room looks very much like the corner cupboard in the parlor, except that it is in the corner. And it also has doors that were modified sometime in the 19th century, replacing the wooden panels with glass panels. The hallway is the formal entrance to the house, possibly as little used in the 18th century as it is today, but it provided the formal stairs to the second floor and the only paneling we find in this house. Most of the house, the walls in the house are covered by more modern plaster, but here we have a little bit of decorative paneling in the stair area. Very typical of paneling in a house in Guilford from this time period. The stairs themselves are quite steep. Apparently, Mr. Griswold wanted to have fairly high ceilings, but he still had a relatively small space, which necessitated steep stairs in his small hallway. This is the kitchen of the Griswold house, and we're seeing the room restored to the colors it was in the early 19th century. The white on the top part of the room reflects light back, while the Spanish red color on the beams and on the bottom part of the room helps cover up dirt. In those days, a kitchen would generate a fair amount of dirt from the fireplace. In this house, we have a very large fireplace, large for its time period, although relatively typical of a Guilford fireplace of its time. There are two bake ovens, both in the back, which was an old-fashioned way of having your bake oven in 1774. By that time, many were being built forward into the fireplace. To use these bake ovens, you make a fire in them and burn the fire for about 2 hours. Then you take the fire out, put your food in, and put the door on. The tin reflector oven sitting in front of the fire space is used for roasting items like a piece of roast beef or chicken. There is also a toaster there and some regular pans for cooking, broiling, frying, and so forth. We do have a crane to hold the pots, although this was originally built with a rod above to hold the trammels. A lug pole it was called. The table is set for eating because people did sometimes eat in the kitchen, usually breakfast and perhaps dinner, especially in the winter when it's very cold. The chairs around the table are heart and crown chairs made in Guilford, believed to be made by the Parmalee family. And our sink is a sandstone sink that's set into a wooden base. It does have a drain that goes outside. However, you bring the water in from the well, and then you would be able to pour water out the sink. More convenient than using the dishpan alone, but still not as convenient as our modern-day plumbing. This would be the best bedroom for the house. George and Nancy Griswold likely spent their nights here. The bed came from the Scranton family in Guilford, has been obviously modified. It originally had high post and would have had curtains in George and Nancy's time. The coverlet is from it's a quilt from our collection. Is it called a strippy quilt? It has strips of fabric, and this one is from the early 19th century. The table The tea table itself is on loan from the Henry Whitfield house. It belonged to Hannah Landon, and Hannah Landon was Nancy Griswold's mother. However, we do think the tea table belonged to a different Hannah Landon. The table is set for tea. Hannah is ready drinking it, using some of the heart and crown chairs. Women often did have tea in their bedchambers, especially during the summer months. And because we're open usually during the summer, we have a summer scene set. The rocking chair descended in the Chittenden family, and the history of the chair is inscribed on the back, a splat of the chair. This is the only one of the bedrooms with a fireplace, and this is quite a high fireplace for 1774, for a bedroom fireplace. It would likely put smoke in the room. We don't use it now, so we really don't know. And we also have one bureau in here that possibly was the top of a high chest as it began life and has been made into a bureau. Such pieces were often separated through inheritance. On the bureau, we have a linen shirt that belonged to Rufus Leet of Leet's Island in Guilford. It was woven by his aunts, Miranda and Wealthy. The flax for the linen was also grown at Leet's Island and processed and spun by them. We've arrived in the lean-to of the Griswold house. The lean-to is what makes the house into a salt box rather than a full two-story house. Here you can see that this has a raised plate. Rather than the rafters coming all the way down to the floor, there are two plates, one for the rafters and one for the floorboards. And you can see the planks coming up here that form the outside of the house. You also hear the quilling wheel and the other yarn winding tools. And we have the loom where we are weaving a stair carpet. This is a Venetian carpet based on a pattern by a Stratford weaver from the early 19th century, and it is for our front hall stair. In our lean-to, you can see the chimney coming up from the first floor. It is stone from top to bottom, held together with a mud-like mortar. The attic would have been used in those times for storage and perhaps extra sleeping space. The lean-to itself, while we use it for textiles, would probably have been used for storage and for sleeping space. Would not have been practical to have a loom in this spot in the days before electricity. Here you can see a full view of the planks. These form the outside walls of the house as well as the inner walls. There are no studs in this house. This part of the lean-to would have been used probably for storage as we use it. Assorted things not in use either seasonally or things you've abandoned. We have the spinning wheels stored up here for their out-of-season time. And we also have barrels of food and like things in the storage area.
Welcome to the Medad Stone Tavern. We are currently in the entrance of the tavern, which, if you were a traveler, this would have been the first room you would have seen when you entered the building. The tavern was built in 1803 by Medad Stone, who was a prominent business figure in town. He owned another tavern on the town green, and he built this building because he believed that the main road, which was going through town, was going to be moved. One of the ideas was it was going to be moved along 3 Mile Course, which is the road that this house is on. So he built it. The road never ended up being moved, so he had a tavern in the middle of nowhere. So there's a possibility that he might not have ever opened it up as a tavern, since there wasn't any main roads. He ended up turning it into a farm, and he leased it out to the Davis family in 1811. The Davis family has been living here ever since, until the last owner of the house, Leonard Hubbard, who passed away in 2001. And he left the house to the Guilford Keeping Society. The Guilford Keeping Society is currently renovating the house to turn it into what an 1803 tavern would have looked like. We currently use the house for many different functions, Memorial Day picnic, Halloween party. We also have wine tastings and silent auctions, and we use the hearth in the kitchen for hearth cooking classes. We are currently standing in the front entrance of the Medad Stone Tavern. Since this building was intended to be a tavern, there are a few architectural features which are a little more extravagant than what you would normally find in an 1803 house. Starting with the stenciling along the walls, this stenciling is a reproduction of the original stenciling in the house. The last owner of the house, Leonard Hubbard, while doing renovations, found the original stenciling and repainted it by hand as to what it would have looked like. The front door, again, a little fancier than a normal house. You have your 6 panels, and the interesting thing is on both sides it has moldings, whereas normally, functionally, it would have only one side. Going up the stairway on the side, the small panels, again, another architectural feature, are all hand-painted to look like wood grain, just to, again, fancy up the stairwell, make it a little more warm welcome to the visitors. We are now standing in the Great Hall or Long Room of the tavern, and as I mentioned earlier, the Keeping Society is currently renovating this building to turn it into what it would have looked like as an 1803 tavern. When we acquired this building, this one room was divided into 2, as you can see in the divisions of the floor. One half of the room being a dining room, and the other half being a modernized kitchen. So we took out the temporary wall and pulled out all the appliances and are trying to turn it back into what it would have looked like. As we were taking down the paint and wallpaper on the walls, we discovered the original stenciling from 1803. There is a border that goes across the top of the ceiling, and there are also borders that go along all the doors and the chair rails, both on the top and the bottom. The patterning that goes around the door jambs does mirror that of what was in the front entrance, although the stenciling on the top of the wall is different than the rest of the stenciling in the house. Although this patterning is the same as what was found in the Thomas Griswold house. We did a study of the paint in the room, and the fireplace is painted in what the colors will eventually look like for the rest of the room. The majority of the room being the blue-green color, and the stenciling would go along the cream of the border. And the wood color is an off-white. And eventually, when the room is completed, this is what the entire room will look like. The floor will also be sanded and most likely be painted in a checkerboard pattern, black and gray or black and green, something along those lines, which was a typical thing to do for a tavern of the time. We are now standing in one of the front parlors of the tavern. This room would have been wallpapered and might possibly would have had carpeting. In the corner, when we found, while cleaning out the house, a table which we believe was one of Medad Stone's original tavern tables from the other tavern that he owned on the town green. And after he built the house, he brought it over here to be used for the tavern here. We are currently standing in the kitchen of the Medad Stone Tavern. And this part of the house, we believe, predates the rest of the house, being built sometime in the late 1790s. The property would have had this part of the house in a barn, we believe. And then when the rest of the tavern was built in 1803, this was turned into the kitchen part. As you can see in front of us, the hearth is quite larger than many other houses of this time period, being built again to be used as a tavern kitchen. The beehive oven is a very large oven and still works and can hold 8 or 9 full-size pies. And this is where we do our hearth cooking classes periodically throughout the year. Moving from the hearth to the left on the dolly there is a stone sink, which this room would have had. This is not the original stone sink, but this sink will eventually fit under the window there. There is a spigot in the wall where water would have been brought in through buckets, and they would have washed the dishes in the sink there, and then it drained out through the wall to the outside of the house. And then moving to the left, there is a cabinet which we found in the basement of the house. The last owner was using it to house his paint and nails, but this cupboard, we believe, was built again in the 1700s and would have been used in this room to house all the china and flatware which you see in there. And everything that is in there is items that we found in the house. We are now at the top of the stairwell on the second floor of the Medad Stone Tavern. And here we have the beginning and the first resident and the last resident of the house. The desk in the corner was Medad Stone's desk, and on top of it is his canteen and powder horn, both of which have been engraved MS. And on the desk there are some pieces of money and also an arrest warrant which we found while cleaning out the house for Medad Stone, written in 1782 for swearing on the town green, showing that he was truly an interesting character and involved in all sorts of different things in town. To the right, against the right-hand wall, are items from Leonard Hubbard, who was the last owner of the house. Again, he was a member of the Davis family, his mother being a Davis, and going all the way back to the original Davises in 1811. He was another prominent member in town and a prominent member in the Keeping Society. He was very interested in preserving the history of Guilford, which is why he left this house to the Keeping Society. So just various memorabilia talking about all the different events of the life of Leonard Hubbard. We are now in the back center room on the second floor, one of the bedrooms in the house. And this room is showing a typical boarding room in the tavern. We have 3 beds here, 3 different beds. The large one here would have been slept, 3 to 4 people, depending on how many you can squeeze in there. And it was put together much like a corset of the time period. It would be sewn up and then a mattress put on top. The small bed in the back was rope strung and would have been used for children or one small person. And then the cot-style bed in the corner, again, would have been used for multiple people. And a typical tavern would have had as many people in a room as they possibly could fit. Not very comfortable for the time, but it would keep you out of the elements. We are now in on the second floor still, the back right bedroom of the house. And this room would have been used for wealthier people or more predominant people who were staying at the tavern. It would have been a single bedroom for either a person or family to stay in, and it was a little fancier furnished than the last bedroom, obviously for more comfort purposes. The bed, again, is a rope-strung bed, and would have just a little more privacy than being in a room with all the other visitors. An interesting architectural feature of this room are the cabinets in the corners, which is typical of this house. The builders of the house, wherever they had room to put in cubbies and cabinets, they did. So there's very interestingly shaped cabinets throughout the house.
Hi, I'd like to welcome you to the Dudley Farm, a late 19th century farm museum located in North Guilford at the corner of Route 77 and 80. It's owned and operated by the Dudley Foundation, a nonprofit member-supported organization dedicated to the preservation of late 19th century farm life. I'd like to show you around the place if you have a few minutes. We're in the dining room of the Dudley Farm, and in many ways, in the past it was the heart of the house, as it is today for many of the activities here. But what I wanted to do is tell you a little bit briefly about the history of the Dudley Farm, both in the past and its most recent history. The house was built in 1844 by Erastus Dudley, and he made some money as a miller across the street on a piece of property that had the West River run through it. Not only did he run a grist mill, but he also set up a tannery, and then that tannery gave him enough of an income to be able to build this house, even though he was in his late 60s at the time. I'll get more into that a little bit later on. But Erastus was the first person to actually live in this house, along with the rest of his family. And from that point on, you had 6 generations living in the farm until the last individual, David Dudley, passed away in 1991. Now, David died without any direct heirs, and that's where it gets sort of interesting and what makes the Dudley Farm such a unique museum. When David passed away, he donated the Dudley Farm to the North Guilford Volunteer Fire Company, which was unique in itself. The firemen were certainly more than pleased to obtain the property, but there came a real problem as to exactly what they would do with it. At the same time, with the level of development taking place in the surrounding communities in North Guilford and Guilford itself, there was a real lament amongst many of them for the loss of farmland as more and more houses were built and more streets were built. And they decided that they wanted to do something for the community. They created the Dudley Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization that took over ownership and now runs the Dudley Farm. The Dudley Foundation, as I said earlier, was dedicated to the whole idea of preserving rural farm life, and that's what this whole place has been about. As you go through the house a little bit later, you'll see that the house depicts what life would have been like in a typical farmhouse around the year 1900. What you're seeing also is the fruits of efforts that took place over the last 10 years. When the Dudley Foundation took over the building, originally there was only a shell left of a 19th century house with hardly any electricity, no furniture, and the building itself was in horrible shape. And over the past 10 years, the Dudley Foundation has gone room by room, restoring the house to what it probably would have looked like at that time. And all the items that you see in the farmhouse today have been donated by members of the community as well as people from the region. Up to this date, we've had thousands of items that have been donated to people to help to restore the house, and it's been a real testimony to community effort. That effort is still ongoing, and every day we obtain more and more items associated not only with life in North Guilford here, but life in the 19th century. The kitchen of the Dudley farm is very typical of what you would have found in your average farmhouse around the year 1900. It includes all the modern amenities of the time, including the wood stove, which would have been used for cooking and for heat, all the modern appliances, including some which baffle people today when they come to visit. Your typical Hoosier, rocking chair, of course, for those brief moments when the women were able to sit and relax a little bit, and of course your kitchen table set with for an upcoming meal, and by most, certainly our standards, a very Spartan sort of way to live. One of the most attractive parts of the kitchen and things that people who come to visit really admire is our kitchen sink with its copper counter looking out the kitchen window. Far cry from what we're used to today. No refrigerator, no electric range, no microwave. But the aromas that must have come out of this kitchen on a daily basis must have been certainly well worth not having those modern conveniences. We're in the parlor of the Dudley farmhouse, which would have been the most formal room and the place where guests would have been brought for when they visited or for entertaining. The types of pieces of furniture you see in here are very typical of the late 19th century. You have a camelback couch, and in the corner there's a rocker recliner, an early model that was all the rage starting around the 1860 or so. To the side of that, there's and then between the windows is a tete-a-tete or a courting couch, which would have been the type of piece of furniture supposedly that when a young man came to court one of the Dudley women, young ladies, they would have been able to sit in a way in which they would be able to converse with each other but not get too close. And of course, Mother Dudley would have been in the rocker recliner the entire time, making sure that they were properly supervised. To the left of the wood stove is a piece of furniture that many people are surprised to see in a parlor of this time period. It's a sewing machine, and it was considered to be a fine piece of furniture in the late 19th century, and the sewing machine itself is underneath the wooden box, and it was something that was valued highly by the ladies certainly who lived in the house here, and by visitors as well. And to the right of that is an old wood stove, which was donated to us by an old North Guilford resident who has since passed away, Clarence Potter. And the story has it that he actually brought this stove to North Guilford in the back of a Model T. Whether or not that story is really true or not, we don't really know, but it's a beautiful piece of workmanship and very typical of the type of parlor stove you would have had in a house of this type. Other rooms in the house include the restored library, which was fairly typical of the type of library you would have found in a relatively well-to-do family around the year 1900. A small bedroom. A late 19th century loom like this would have been found in many of the houses in North Guilford, as they made rag rugs as a source of extra income. And two bedrooms, one a child's bedroom and the other a bedroom for Mabel, who was a teenage daughter around the year 1900. Okay, one of the things that makes the Dudley Farm unique as a museum is the fact that we have livestock that represent the type of animals you would have found on a farm in the late 19th century, including Nate and Lou, our resident oxen, and their handler, Mark Dudley, as well as sheep, goats, chickens, and hopefully in the future some other types of animals, including cows, horses, and pigs.